So I'll be talking today about words, pictures being worth 1,000 words. And I want to start with a question that many people here have thought a lot about. So if you see a visual depiction of an event, how do we construct a description of that linguistically in real time? And this has actually been a very fruitful area of research. There's a lot of really interesting eye tracking work, for example, showing that looking at people's eye movements as they do linguistic encoding, event encoding linguistic formulation has revealed a lot of insights into how language works. So we know quite a lot about when we see a visual depiction and put it into words, how that unfolds. And I wanted to today kind of flip that around and ask, when you read or hear a sentence, like the classic, the dog chased the mailman, what kind of visual spatial representation does that evoke in your mind, if any? So this is the direction I wanted to think about today, in particular, thinking about how the syntactic, semantic, and discourse properties of different entities in transitive events influence how we think about them spatially. And I'll start with the notion of agentivity, and I want to convince you that maybe some of the results we'll be seeing here might help us think more generally about the notion of prominence, which is known to be a very slippery, complex thing that crops up in all kinds of places. Before I start, I wanted to acknowledge work on situation models, which also asks the question of what kind of situation or mental model do you build up when you're getting linguistic input. And I think that'll ultimately also be relevant here, even though I won't say too much about that today. But now, if we want to elicit visual spatial representations of linguistic input, how do we tap into that? How do we do that? And actually, we used, following prior work, a very simple task. Namely, we asked people to draw things. Now, if you're like me, you're thinking, oh, I cannot draw a dog chasing a mailman, or that would just be quite a difficult thing. So instead, we made it easier for people. We used shapes. So now, everybody needs to have their visual spatial processing ready. Imagine you get a sentence, like the triangle chased the circle, and then I hand you a piece of paper and a pen. If you were in class, I would make you do this in person, but you can just imagine it, now. So I'll give you a moment. You can imagine drawing it, and you might draw something maybe like this, perhaps, if you're like me. Or if you're a bit more so inclined, you could have something more exciting happening, a triangle chasing that circle more energetically. Or maybe you drew them in this position, this orientation. In fact, the question I want to ask is, how many of you put the triangle on the left in your mental model versus how many people put it on the right? Okay, how many people said left? How many people put it on the right? Okay, and actually, I want to look at those right hands. This is super interesting. We're going to come back to this. Okay, so this is the phenomenon that's being called the spatial agency bias, and it's been found looking largely at English, and we'll come back to this, that participants typically put the agent to the left of where they put the patient. And I've just given you a few quotes here from different authors, that the left is more strongly linked to agency and so on. Crucially, as noted there in red, this holds in languages where the script is written left to right. That's where we get the left side bias. In languages that are written and read from right to left, here's where the hands that I saw are very relevant, things can go in the other direction. And this, people haven't just used drawing tasks, they've used picture matching and reaction times and other things in quite a big literature. And I wanted to flag we'll just actually give it a name, the SAB, spatial agency bias, that we conceptualize events in English with a left to right trajectory, with the left side linked with agentivity. Now, this actually has implications for people have claimed for all kinds of other domains as well, including how people are portrayed in portraits in terms of more or less agentive. So if you know your US currency, which apparently I do not, the correct image of Washington is the one on, I think, the left, right? Where you, left or right, anyway, my side. So the one where you see more of his right cheek, because he's oriented leftward, so he's shown as being more agentive. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff with portraits and so on that I'm going to put aside for now, but feel free to ask me. The key intuition is that there's this idea that agentive things are more important, more salient in some way, and these more important, more salient entities get to occupy a privileged spatial position. In English, this is left. Other languages, it's right. That's actually not so crucial for me today. As a quick side note, before we continue, you might be wondering what determines which side it goes. Is it left or right? Many people have commented on script directionality, so the way that you read and write in a language, kind of training you to have a mental schema that goes a certain way. Other people have proposed this might be also strengthened by word order patterns. Subjects come before objects in most languages of the world. This also claims this actually could be a language-independent brain mechanism issue. There's interesting links to things like snark and the number line and pseudo-neglect and all kinds of stuff. For now, all I'll say that for me today, whether it's left or right is actually not crucial. What's interesting is that there seems to be one slot that's somehow special, wherever that position is. And I've been talking about agentivity and agents a lot. Now, Ben, you're probably thinking, well, not every sentence has an agent, right? We know this as people who work on language. So we have things like the dog chased the mailman with a clear agentive subject dog, but we also have sentences like the dog feared the mailman or the dog frightened the mailman, where we have an experience and a stimulus or stimulus and experiencer and no agent in the sentence. So a very simple question is what happens here? So today, I wanted to start by simply asking, is the spatial agency bias just something about agency? How is it influenced by other factors that have to do with prominence? And maybe you might disagree with this, it can help us understand the notion of prominence. So I'll talk about two experiments. The first one, we're going to be playing around with syntactic prominence, subject, non-subject, semantic prominence, agent, non-agent. In the second study, we'll also bring in, because I like thinking about discourse and topicality, discourse level prominence with topics and non-topics. And I wanted to let you know this is the very, very early stages of what might be a bigger project. So feedback, objections, and everything is very, very welcome. I'm sure there's a lot that we don't know yet. And as I said, this might lead to an interesting tool to think about prominence more generally. So in the first experiment, we used a drawing task building on the prior literature, where people simply saw a sentence and they drew over the internet using their finger or kind of a touchpad or whatever, a little sketch. We told them it doesn't have to be beautiful to not make people get too anxious. So in the first study, we had a simple 2x2 design where we had agent-patient verbs and stimulus-experiencer verbs, so verbs like chase and kick and tickle, or amaze, inspire, and impress and irritate. And then we tested active voice and passive voice, because with the passive, of course, we can kick that agent into the by phrase with agent-patient verbs and just reverse the argument order. Now, there is a little bit of, actually a lot of prior work on actives and passives in some respects. It's well known that the passive voice in English, like the circle was chased by the triangle, that boosts the circle to a prominent position. That's been claimed independently of any of the spatial stuff. But there is actually a bit of work on the spatial agency bias literature showing that the passive voice weakens the left side agent bias, which seems to make a lot of sense. However, a prior work, to the best we can figure out, didn't really look at verb thematic roles. Everything seems to be agentive verbs. We don't really know. So we don't really know how non-agentive subjects would pattern. So there's at least three logical possibilities. Option one, if it's just agentivity, then agent should go on the left. If it's just subjecthood, then syntactic subject should go on the left. Or perhaps both are contributing, perhaps to different degrees. So if it's just agentivity, then we would predict that those things I've put there in the purple boxes, the subject and active voice agent patient verbs and the biphrase agent, they should occur on the left. And for the stimulus experiencer verbs, who knows? There is no agent. It is unclear what we would predict there if it's simply an agentivity thing. Of course, if it's subjecthood, easy prediction, the syntactic subject should always go on the left. And if both are playing a role, then we expect that for the active agent patient, the triangle chased the circle. Well, the subject and the agent converge, should be a strong left side bias. The passivized agent-patient, the triangle was chased by the circle. Here we might expect competition between the two. And in the stimulus experiencer, well, there's no agent, but there is a subject. So we might get a subject, if subjecthood matters, we might get a left side bias for the subject, maybe a bit weaker than the agentivity. By the way, if I'm super loud, let me know. Sometimes I get a bit excited talking about these things. Okay, here's just a couple other targets, and also we had different kinds of fillers, happy to talk about that too, to kind of try to mask the purpose of the task, to make sure people weren't too focused on left-right stuff. And here's a few sample drawings to give you a sense of what we got. Here we have an oval tackling the hexagon. We chose shapes that would be easy to code and to distinguish, so we paired them with each other to avoid overlap or similarity. Here's a much more aggressive oval doing the tackling. Here we have a circle chasing the triangle. You'll see here the agent triangle is on the right. Here we have the rectangle infuriating the semicircle. It does look quite infuriated. And the rectangle was infuriated by the semicircle, the passivized version. Now, not everybody did faces. We kind of told people they can add stuff if they want to, because for us, all that really matters is that we can tell which is on the left and which is on the right. So what did we get? So in this first study, I'm going to plot everything in terms of how often the subject was drawn on the right. I'm doing subject and not agent because not everything has an agent, right? So the subject on the left is our dependent variable there. We have the agent-patient verbs on the left and the stimulus experiencer verbs on the right. And if we look at the active agent-patient verbs, here we get tall blue bar, lots of subjects. On the left, the subject is the agent, so this replicates the classic SAB effect and shows that it obtains, even with internet stuff, even with if people are drawing in whatever unusual internet-based way, which is different from the older studies, we still replicate this classic effect. So that is reassuring. Now, in the passive voice, here we're at chance. So here we find that, so when we're carefully controlling now for verb type, unlike the prior work where it's a bit hard to know what kind of verbs they used, we find clear evidence that the subject and the agent are both competing to be on the left. So we get this both subjecthood and agentivity playing a role. Now what about the stimulus experiencer verbs that have no agent? Here, people are just putting the subject on the left, regardless of the active or passive. So here they're just going with syntactic subject in the absence of any agent in the sentence. So what we find, just to summarize what I showed you, is the red bars, the stimulus experiencer verbs. Here people are just going via subjecthood, putting the subject on the left. But with agent-patient verbs, when both agentivity and subjecthood play a role, so when they diverge, we get that competition effect. So this supports our third option, that both agentivity and subjecthood are playing a role in how we spatially visualize these things. So we take this as evidence that both syntactic prominence in terms of grammatical subjects and semantic prominence that we defined as agents are guiding visuospatial representations. I'll just say briefly, of course, stimulus and experiencer roles are also actually not equally semantically prominent, and we aren't seeing effects of that so much. So I'm happy to actually talk about that more. So it does seem that agent, non-agent seems to be what is driving the thematic prominence effects. And something I wanted to highlight here is that agentivity is not required for spatial asymmetry to emerge. So calling it a spatial agentivity bias is a bit of a misnomer, right? Because we get the asymmetry just based on syntactic subjecthood when there's no agent in the sentence with the stimulus experiencer verbs like amaze and impress. But more broadly, what we think this is evidence for is that factors that make something more syntactically prominent or more semantically prominent favor this privileged left side placement in English, at least. Now, so far, I've been just talking about things within a sentence on the sentence level. We can determine both of these syntactic subjecthood and agentivity given just the sentence level, clause level properties. What if we go beyond the clause? What if we think about the level of the discourse? Does prominence on the level of the discourse also boost left side placement? And now here, here's where things get very slippery, because what is prominent in discourse? Many of us have thought a lot about this. Here for now, I'm taking a very simplistic approach and thinking about it in terms of being topical, being discourse given, versus being new information. So we'll see if that plays a role. So for this, in the second experiment, what we did is we added a preamble such that we could create conditions where the subject was topical, already mentioned, pronominalized, or where the object was topical, already mentioned. So tell me about the hexagon, it chased the circle. So here the subject is pronoun, it's given, it's a topic. Or tell me about the hexagon, oh no. Tell me about the circle, it was chased by the hexagon. And same thing with the object topic, where we had now the pronoun in object position. So here, just to mention, we know from prior work, independent of the spatial asymmetries, that being realized with a pronoun and being discourse given makes something topical, makes something prominent, makes something salient. So we want to ask, does this show up in the spatial domain as well? And if this obtains even with object pronouns, this would show that topicality alone can trigger these left side prominence effects independently of subjecthood or agentivity. So again, people actually saw little dialogues, and then they drew their little picture, and what did we find? When the subject was pronominalized, the ones I marked in yellow, oh, by the way, just to mention, in all of these studies, I'm just reporting the horizontally drawn things. People did draw a few things vertically, quite rare, so we just put those aside for now. But when the subject is pronominalized, it actually basically looks just like experiment 1. So if you look at those red bars, stimulus experiencer verbs, then people put the pronominalized subject on the left. When we look at the blue bars, the agent-patient verbs, we see the same asymmetry. I've just copied here again the stuff from experiment 1, where we see this conflict between subjecthood and agentivity. But what happens when a non-subject is a topic? That's really the interesting condition here. If the non-subject is pronominalized, does the subject still get to be on the left? Like, what happens here? And what we see is, actually, a non-pronominalized subject doesn't get to be on the left very often, right? So the only time it gets to be on the left is when it is an agent. So the square tickled it. Here, we still get a significant difference such that people put the square tickled it, the square more on the left. But in most cases, when we have a pronominalized object, that pronominalized object gets to be drawn on the left. In simple terms, I know it's a lot of bars, basically the topic gets to be on the left. Right, so here you don't have to be a subject, you don't have to be an agent, but if you're a topic, then that favors left side placement. So where does this leave us? So we have started a systematic investigation of the spatial agency bias that jointly manipulates syntactic, semantic, and discourse properties. And what we've seen so far is, indeed, agentivity and subjecthood are both at play. We saw that in both studies. And crucially, when we go beyond the sentence and look at the discourse level, topicality is also at play and boosts getting to be in that privileged spatial position. And I would like to take this as evidence that different levels, different linguistic levels of kind of prominence cues all seem to feed into this visuospatial representation. So we have syntactic prominence, semantic prominence, and discourse level prominence. So the thing that I'm interested in hearing people's reactions to is, could these spatial asymmetries provide a tool to explore the notion of prominence? And I say prominence is kind of poorly understood because it's so widely used and we all use it in kind of quite different ways. In fact, there's many linguistic phenomena that make reference to the notion of prominence or salience. We talk about information structure, topics being prominent, but also foci can be prominent. There's phenomena like differential object marking, special morphological marking in some languages that people say is linked to prominence, and things like animacy, or things like definiteness, or what the verb agrees with in many languages depends on how prominent the referent is. Or things like word order. So I think there's this question of, if we test these different ways that are different things that make reference to prominence, could there be some underlying core that we could detect? Would they have similar effects on the spatial biases that we might be able to detect which might help us understand if there's a hope of unifying the notion of prominence, or if we just should keep the different things separate. Of course, there's also non-linguistic aspects like social status, gender animacy, also intentionality, that could all feed into this notion of how prominent things are. So I'll just leave you with kind of the take-home that I think we do have evidence that visuospatial event representations that comprehenders build can be guided by different kinds of prominence, which could be a new way to gain insights into this difficult question of should we try to unify this in some way. So we'll see. And I wanted to thank my undergraduate research assistants who coded huge numbers of drawings very carefully and helped us develop the coding guidelines. And also thank you for your attention.
Lucas Lee from Cornell University. There is a body of research on handedness. So for example, people have found that because culture is biased towards the right hands, people prefer politicians who speak on the right side. People prefer letters that appear on the right side of the keyboard because it's easier to type, even for left-handed people, just because the culture it just prefers or has a bias towards right-handedness. But you found that in this case, the left side was, I guess, more salient. So I'm wondering, how would you rectify this contradiction if you think that, if there even is a contradiction that you see?
Yeah, thank you. And actually, the handedness question is a very good one. From what I know, people have controlled, or they've looked at handedness in the SAB literature. And I don't think they find very strong correlations with handedness, which is, I think, an interesting question. That was actually one of the reasons we were curious to see what happens, because, potentially people drawing with a pen versus drawing digitally, people also could do that differently. So we wanted to see whether we would get the same pattern that people had gotten with pen and paper tasks. But I think for now, perhaps there is no contradiction from what I know, but that's then kind of a puzzle to explain, because I'm also familiar, with the keyboard asymmetries and stuff, so that would be something to kind of ponder.
Yeah,
yes.
This is so interesting. Thank you.
Sarah Branchmet, Vanderbilt. In the drawing literature, one of the things they care about is the relationship of psychological distance to the distance between the characters and the relative size of the characters. That would be interesting to explore. The question is channeling Mary Hayhoe and the idea that you can use vision and space to offload cognitive resources. I wonder, were your preambles on screen when they were drawing? If not, I wonder if in the object pronominal case, one of the reasons they're choosing to draw the character on the left is because they're offloading that from memory in order to be able to plan the rest of the sentence.
Yes, thank you. Those are actually really good points. Now, they were on the screen. They saw basically exactly this. But I would love to see if we could push around the preferences by taking things off the screen. Yes, I think that's definitely something we should think about.
Hi, I'm Jackie from University of Maryland. Thank you for the great talk. I really like the talk and the drawings as well. Well, my question is actually about another population, let's say kids, preschoolers who weren't exposed to orthography yet. Do you think that there could be a universal starting point where people tend to have this left bias for the most prominent thing, or you think that could be pretty much it's random, people could be choosing left or right? Yeah.
Yes, actually, that can help us. Great question, because there's those competing claims about where is this coming from? Is it coming from the writing system, or is it coming from word order patterns, or is it just some brain thing? And okay, so a developmental person, I would love to work with you to see what do preschoolers do, or maybe Jesse's saying.
We already know they have massive
Okay.
exposure to left-right when they're getting picture books, right? Parents are reading
That's
the left
true.
page before the right page.
That's true.
And I
Okay.
think for snark effect and stuff, it's all well established by then.
So they would have.
So you could look at preverbal infants or monkeys.
Yes. So, yes, yeah,
Let
each one
them
would have to
draw.
go quite young to avoid the exposure, yes. But that's a really good question, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Elsie. Two thoughts for future work, and I guess they're questions in a way, because you may have ways to disentangle them now. The first one, I think, bounces off of what Sarah said. I'm wondering, and for me, it doesn't matter whether the sentences are up there or not. I'm wondering if the minute you start to hear one noun, you plan your drawing, right? this doesn't account for your semantic effect, but all the other effects. The minute you hear a noun, you plan your drawing left to right, because you're used to writing and executing left to right. And if that effect, that package of effects is driven by this, it seems like you might get somewhere by disrupting the ability to plan drawing while you're actually listening to or reading the sentence. So for example, you can imagine having multiple tasks that you're doing with these sentences, and you only get the signal that you're doing a drawing task after you've finished hearing the sentences and they're no longer there. It seems like that should decrease those effects then, but maybe keep the semantic effects in place.
Yes, yeah, so once it's like some kind of maybe interference, one would have to think carefully about the right kind of interference task that would tap into preventing the draw.
Not interference.
No.
I'm thinking about
Prevent-
variability in tasks. On some trials, you're going to draw. On other trials, you're going to answer questions or something. So you don't
Okay.
know what you're in until after you've heard or seen the sentences and they've gone, right? So you might be creating a semantic representation and then going from that as opposed to, actual auditory kind of representation. The next thing I'm thinking about is the semantic effect. Like, people mean all sorts of things when they say agent, right? And I think you and I mean slightly different things. I mean the first argument of cause, in which case your stimulus experiencer verbs are definitely agentive, right? And so that makes me have to think, well, what else could you mean by this, right? And one of the things I started wondering about is animacy. So when you look at the work on emerging languages, or people who have only partially acquired a sign language, what you see is a really strong animate first bias, right? Not agent first bias. And actually it links up with the left-right bias too in some of these studies as well. And so one of the things I'm wondering is that the stimulus experiencer verbs probably imply that both of their arguments are necessarily animate, whereas I imagine that the agent-patient verbs are somewhat variable. Chase does, right, tickle, push, hit, etc. does not. And so you may have enough variability in your verbs to see whether it is the animate, inanimate, asymmetric verbs that are driving your passive effect there.
Yes, and actually, thank you. These are excellent points. I'm trying to write everything down.
Super cool.
And actually, and just to clarify, so our definition of agent was going off of kind of the thematic role labels, which I agree are complex. And actually, just to add to the animacy point, I've been thinking a lot about intentionality and intent and like volitionality, which closely relates to animacy, because one could imagine even with the stimulus experiencer verbs, like I could irritate you on purpose with great volition, or I could irritate you accidentally.
Yep.
And who knows? So I think that's actually something that we would like to, in our list of things to kind of poke at carefully once they get more feedback, to kind of get at that. And I think the animacy would tie into that. So then it would be a more fine-grained, rather than just labeling it with these agent experiential labels, it would get a much more nuanced picture.
Another thing you could do is code whether there are actual animate features on your circles and triangles and see if that predicts anything.
That would actually, yes, that
Yeah.
would be fun to do, and we could definitely do that. Thank you, and check the verbs, yep.
Hi, Wesley Orth, University of Toronto. I put the triangle on the right. But when I was sort of imagining myself drawing, I did draw the triangle first. And I was thinking, the order in which people draw things is maybe another interesting metric by which we can judge their prominence. And something that's also important about the order that you draw in sort of a paradigm like this is it doesn't have any sort of impact on the artifact produced unless you have like a really leaky pen and the lines are getting weaker as you go. Whereas, the spatial orientation, that's something that the listener or the drawer provides, but it's also something that whoever's looking at the drawing is going to make interpretations about. But that's something that disappears when you look at sort of just what order are you doing these things in sort of these simple tableaus where, you don't have like overlapping foreground, background stuff going on. So I was wondering if you had thought anything about like sort of looking at the unfolding of the drawing as well as sort of the final artifact that was produced.
Yes, and in a way that also makes me think of a bit like audience design in a way that, what am I doing for me versus what am I doing for like the end product in a way. We have thought about that, and I haven't yet, I need to figure out the right technical way to do that, right? So for this, actually, we just figured out a way to make Qualtrics help us record the drawings online. But with that, I don't think we can get temporal interpretation, but we have thought about that, and I think it'd be amazing to try to tap into that. So if anybody has any software recommendations or like ideas, and one could, in lab if people are being videotaped, but if you're being videotaped, then you're being observed, and that changes things. But I think it's an excellent question, and that's something that we cannot yet shed light on, but absolutely.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, quick question. Kyle Christensen, University of Illinois. Very cool talk. This is fun. I like tying this kind of thing into the left-right bias kind of idea. I just wanted to just in case, and you probably know this, so in the linguistic literature, there's a long history of, like Judith Asen and others, of these prominence hierarchies, animate, inanimate, agent, patient, subject, object, that are, you can formalize and say optimality theory, and the more the hierarchies align, the bigger the chance the thing is prominent. If things align, even if they are prominent on some scales but not others, if they don't align, then they're less prominent. And this goes for both linguistic, like proximate, obviative, and and animate, inanimate, and things like that too. I'm sure you're aware of that, but it's a very complex sort of situation, and it'd be even more fun to look at in a language with extremely flexible word order. So.
Yes, and actually, can I just say yes and like shout out to like proximate obviative? I've been thinking about that independently, so yes, very much in line with this. So thank you.